There are moments in life when people disappear without warning. Conversations stop, relationships end, support vanishes, and you sit there replaying everything, asking yourself what you did wrong, what you could have said differently, why they walked away when you needed them most. But hear this carefully, woman of God. Not everyone who left your life walked away on their own. Some were removed by God Himself, and it wasn't because you were too much. It was because what He placed inside you was too valuable to be contaminated. You didn't lose them by accident. Heaven was involved. God saw what you couldn't see. He heard conversations you never heard. He knew intentions you never imagined. And before the enemy could use proximity to delay your destiny, God stepped in and began to separate you. That sudden distance, that unexplained cutoff, that silence that felt cruel, it was mercy disguised as loss. There are people who can walk with you through comfort but not through calling. There are relationships that survive convenience but collapse under consecration. And when God begins to elevate you spiritually, emotionally, or purposefully, He will remove anyone who would drain, distract, or diminish what He's building in you. Not because they're evil, but because they're incompatible with where you're going. Some of you are grieving people God already released. You're praying for reconnection, while God is saying, I answered that prayer by removing them. You're asking for closure while God is saying, I closed that door for your protection. What felt like abandonment was actually divine intervention. What felt like rejection was alignment. What felt like isolation was preparation. God is not cruel with His pruning. He is precise. He removes what cannot produce fruit in the next season. And if you are watching this right now with tears in your eyes, feeling misunderstood, feeling alone, feeling separated, I need you to know this. God did not remove them to punish you. He removed them to preserve you. Because where He's taking you, not everyone can go. What you experienced was not random, and it was not chaos. It may have felt sudden, confusing, even cruel, but God does not operate in accidents. When people were removed from your life, it wasn't because things slipped out of His hands. It was because His hands were already at work. You need to understand this deeply. God's removals are intentional. Every separation carries purpose, even when it carries pain. There are seasons where God allows people to walk beside you, and there are seasons where He quietly steps in and changes the seating arrangement of your life. Not everyone who enters your story is meant to stay until the end. Some are there to reveal something, teach something, expose something, or activate something in you. And once that purpose is fulfilled, God does not negotiate with sentiment. He moves with precision. You may have begged God to fix a relationship, to restore a connection, to soften someone's heart. But instead of restoration, you got distance. Instead of answers, you got silence. Instead of closure, you got separation. That wasn't God ignoring you. That was God protecting you from something you couldn't yet discern. Sometimes God answers prayers by removing the very thing you're praying to keep. People often assume that if something leaves, it means failure. But in the spiritual realm, removal often signals advancement. God removes what cannot handle the weight of where He's taking you. He removes what would eventually compete with His voice in your life. He removes what would demand loyalty that belongs only to Him. If certain people had stayed, you would have stayed, smaller to accommodate them. Think about how many times you compromised your peace to keep access to people God was already trying to distance. How many times you silenced your discernment because your emotions were louder. How many red flags you painted white because you were afraid of being alone. God saw the future version of you and knew those connections would become liabilities, not blessings. God is not emotional in His decisions. He is intentional. He doesn't remove people impulsively. He removes them after long observation. He watches patterns you excuse. He hears words you dismiss. He sees motives you romanticize. And when He knows a relationship will eventually cost you obedience, clarity, or identity, He intervenes. This is why the separation didn't come with a warning. If God had explained everything, you would have resisted Him. If He had shown you the full picture, you might have tried to save what He was ending. So instead, He allowed things to collapse naturally. Conversations changed. Effort became one-sided. Respect faded. And slowly, painfully, the connection dissolved. What you called heartbreak was God cutting off what would have broken you later. What you called loss was God preventing deeper damage. Some people were close enough to wound you but never committed enough to protect you. God removed them before they could sabotage your confidence, your calling, or your future. And let's be honest, some of the removals hurt because they exposed misplaced trust. You trusted people more than God. You leaned on relationships instead of revelation. You drew identity from approval instead of assignment. So God lovingly disrupted what you were depending on so you could rediscover who He called you to be without external validation. God never removes without replacement, but He does allow a gap. That gap is uncomfortable because it forces intimacy, with Him. It forces you to listen instead of lean. It forces you to grow instead of cling. It forces you to mature beyond emotional dependency. That lonely space you hate is where God recalibrates your discernment. Some of the people who left didn't leave because they were bad. They left because they couldn't follow you into obedience. Your growth convicted them. Your boundaries offended them. Your clarity threatened them. And rather than change, they chose distance. God simply honored their exit. You were not abandoned. You were extracted. You were not rejected. You were redirected. You were not forgotten. You were being repositioned for alignment with His will. And the hardest truth is this: if God had not removed them, you would have delayed yourself trying to carry what He never asked you to carry. You would have drained yourself trying to maintain what He was trying to end. You would have stayed stuck explaining yourself to people who were never meant to understand you. God's removals are not punishment. They are precision. They are mercy. They are strategy unfolding in real time, even when it feels like loss. What made the removal so painful wasn't just who left. It was how suddenly your identity felt shaken. When God removes people intentionally, He is not just changing your surroundings, He is confronting the parts of you that were attached to those surroundings. There were versions of you that existed only because certain people were present. You spoke a certain way, tolerated certain things, diminished certain truths, all to preserve connection. And God, in His mercy, began to dismantle that version of you. You didn't realize how much of your confidence was borrowed, how much of your worth was being reinforced externally, how often you checked the temperature of others before trusting the witness of the Spirit within you. God saw that if He allowed, though, say relationships to continue, your discernment would remain muted. So He removed the noise so you could finally hear yourself think and hear Him speak without interruption. That season after the separation felt hollow. Conversation stopped. Invitations disappeared. Your phone grew quiet. And that silence didn't just surround you, it echoed inside you. Because without those people, you were forced to sit with questions you had avoided. Who am I without being needed? Who am I without being affirmed? Who am I when no one is watching, choosing, or validating me? God uses removal to expose dependency, not to shame you, but to heal you. Some of the relationships you lost were stabilizers you leaned on instead of standing firm on God's word. They weren't evil, but they became replacements for intimacy with Him. And God will never compete for first place in your life. If something or someone begins to rival His voice, He will lovingly but firmly intervene. This is why the separation triggered anxiety, because when external anchors disappear, internal instability rises. You felt disoriented not because you were weak, but because you were recalibrating. God was teaching you how to self-govern spiritually instead of emotionally reacting to others' presence or absence. He was strengthening your inner world so your outer world could change without destroying you. You were learning how to make decisions without consensus, how to obey without applause, how to trust discernment without confirmation. That kind of maturity cannot develop in crowded rooms. It requires solitude. It requires quiet. It requires moments where your faith stands alone, unsupported by agreement or familiarity. And yes, there were nights when you questioned yourself. You wondered if you were too much, too intense, too different. But the truth is, you were becoming too clear to be comfortably misunderstood. God was sharpening your spiritual senses, and clarity often isolates before it attracts alignment. The people who were removed didn't leave because you failed. They left because the version of you God was forming could no longer be managed, controlled, or influenced by them. Your boundaries grew, your tolerance shrank, your discernment heightened, and what once felt normal now felt heavy. That discomfort was the signal that you were outgrowing environments God never intended to sustain you. God wasn't emptying your life, He was making room. Room for truth without compromise, room for obedience without distraction, room for relationships that wouldn't require you to betray yourself to be accepted. The isolation wasn't rejection, it was refinement. You were learning to stand without leaning. There is another layer to this removal that many don't understand. God didn't just remove people to strengthen you, He removed them to protect what He placed inside you. Not everyone deserves access to your becoming. Not everyone can witness transformation without trying to interfere with it. Some people don't know how to love you while you are changing. They only know how to love the version of you that was convenient for them. God saw conversations that would have drained you, opinions that would have delayed you, advice that sounded loving but would have led you away from obedience. So He closed doors quietly, sometimes painfully, but always intentionally. He shielded your future by limiting your exposure in the present. This is why the separation didn't come with replacement right away. God wasn't punishing you with loneliness. He was protecting you from premature connection. If He had introduced new people too quickly, you might have carried old patterns into new relationships. You might have repeated cycles instead of breaking them. So He slowed you down, enough for healing to take root. You needed time to detox from emotional habits that felt normal but were unhealthy. Over-explaining, over-giving, over-functioning, over-accommodating. God wanted you to recognize how often you abandoned yourself to keep others comfortable. That awareness only comes when there is no one left to perform for. And in that stillness, you began to notice your own voice again, your own convictions, your own desires. You started realizing how often you ignored discomfort because you feared abandonment. Now that abandonment had already happened, fear lost its leverage. You were no longer negotiating truth for belonging. God was teaching you how to be whole, not attached, grounded, not entangled, secure, not dependent. This kind of wholeness changes everything. It changes how you choose. It changes how you respond. It changes who is allowed access to your energy, your emotions, your future. Some of the people who left would have required you to remain small. Others would have demanded loyalty over obedience. Others would have tried to shape your calling instead of supporting it. God removed them before resentment, bitterness, or compromise took root. He protected your heart by pruning your environment. You may not realize it yet, but the version of you that is emerging would have frightened the old connections. Not because you are arrogant or distant, but because you are anchored. And anchored people cannot be easily swayed. God knew that where He is taking you requires discernment without dependency, love without self-betrayal, connection without compromise. And those capacities are forged in isolation. What felt like emptiness was actually insulation. God was insulating you from noise, from pressure, from opinions that would have clouded your obedience. He was allowing your roots to grow deeper where no one could see them, so that when you reemerge, you would not be easily uprooted. This removal wasn't the end of your story. It was the end of a chapter that could not continue if the next one was going to begin. At some point during the isolation, you began to notice something unsettling but undeniable. You were changing faster than you could explain. The things that once moved you no longer had the same power. Conversations that used to excite you now felt shallow. Even your tolerance for certain behaviors, jokes, or compromises quietly disappeared. This wasn't pride. This wasn't coldness. This was spiritual acceleration. God removes people intentionally when your pace no longer matches theirs. Not everyone is called to move at the speed of obedience. Some are comfortable lingering in cycles, revisiting the same lessons, repeating the same mistakes. But when God places His hand heavily on a woman, He increases her velocity. He shortens the distance between instruction and obedience, and that kind of momentum makes misalignment obvious. You felt it when being around certain people started draining you instead of energizing you, not because they were bad, but because they were familiar with an older version of you. Familiarity can become friction when growth begins. They expected you to respond the same way, prioritize the same things, tolerate the same dynamics. But you couldn't anymore, not without violating what God was doing inside you. This is when guilt tried to creep in. You wondered if you were becoming distant, selfish, or unloving. But love doesn't require access. Love doesn't demand proximity. Love doesn't insist on staying where God has clearly moved you out of. Sometimes obedience looks like separation without explanation. God was teaching you how to honor growth without apologizing for it, how to let go without justifying your decision, how to move forward without dragging old attachments behind you. Because anything you drag will eventually slow you down. The isolation accelerated your discernment. You started seeing patterns clearly. You recognized emotional manipulation faster. You felt uneasy sooner. You stopped needing repeated evidence to trust what the Spirit was already revealing. This is maturity. This is what happens when God trains your senses in silence. And that acceleration wasn't meant to isolate you forever. It was meant to prepare you for environments where clarity is required, where decisions matter, where influence carries weight. God was increasing your capacity by stripping distractions, because the next season demands precision, not people-pleasing. You are becoming the kind of woman who can enter a room and feel the atmosphere shift, not because of noise, but because of presence. That kind of authority is formed when you stop outsourcing validation and start standing fully rooted in who God says you are. The removal wasn't rejection, it was recalibration. God adjusted your pace so you could walk in step with Him instead of matching the rhythm of those around you. There is one final truth about why God removed them intentionally, and it's the one most people struggle to accept. God removed them because they would not recognize you in your next season. They knew your history, but they could not perceive your destiny, and God will never allow familiarity to sabotage future assignment. Some people only know how to relate to you through past versions of you. They reference who you were, not who you're becoming. They remember your wounds, your mistakes, your seasons of weakness, and while they may mean well, their perception becomes a ceiling. God removes those ceilings before He elevates you. You are stepping into a season where your voice would carry authority, your presence would demand respect, and your obedience, woe. You'll provoke reaction. Not everyone can handle that shift. Some would have tried to remind you of who you used to be. Others would have questioned your confidence. Others would have subtly resisted your growth while pretending to support it. God saw all of it before it happened. So He intervened early. The isolation wasn't just about your healing, it was about your positioning. God was separating you so you could be seen clearly by the right people at the right time. Because when destiny connections come, they must meet the current version of you, not a diluted one shaped by old expectations. This season taught you how to be alone without being lonely, how to trust God without a crowd, how to stand firm without constant reassurance. That kind of inner stability is rare, and it's necessary for what's coming next. You learned how to hear God without filters, how to sit in silence without anxiety, how to move without announcement. These are the traits of a woman God entrusts with influence. Not the loud, not the desperate, not the attention-seeking, but the anchored. God removed them because where He's taking you requires discernment, strength, and clarity that cannot be sustained by emotional entanglement. You are entering rooms where compromise will be tempting, where pressure will be subtle, where authority must be exercised without fear of rejection, and the woman you are now, shaped by isolation, refined by silence, strengthened by obedience, is ready. You don't need to chase replacements. You don't need to recreate the past. God will introduce connections that recognize your present and honor your future. Relationships that don't require explanation, alignment that feels effortless, support that doesn't come with strings attached. What God removed was never meant to last. What He's preparing will remain. And if you're listening to this right now, feeling the weight of what you lost and the uncertainty of what's ahead, let this settle in your spirit. God has not mismanaged your life. Nothing left you without His permission. Nothing disappeared without purpose. The isolation was not a punishment. It was an invitation. an invitation to become whole, clear, anchored, and ready. You were not abandoned, you were selected, and the silence you walked through was not empty, it was sacred.